The coffee cup trembled in Maya Chen's hands as she watched the CEO of Meridian Industries pace behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 32nd floor conference room. The amber liquid sloshed dangerously close to the rim, mirroring the chaos that had erupted in the boardroom just moments before. Steam rose from the cup like incense in a temple, carrying with it the bitter aroma of Colombian beans and the even more bitter taste of corporate desperation. "We're looking at a class action lawsuit that could bankrupt us," Richard Townsend's voice cracked as he spoke to the assembled legal team. His usually pristine silver hair was disheveled, and his Armani suit bore the wrinkles of a man who had spent the night wrestling with documents instead of sleeping. "The plaintiff's attorneys are claiming our standard employment contracts contain illegal clauses. Every employee we've hired in the past 5 years, that's over 12,000 people, could be entitled to damages." Maya stood invisibly in the corner of the room, her service uniform a stark contrast to the tailored suits surrounding the mahogany table. She had been refilling water glasses and clearing plates from the emergency board meeting when the conversation turned to legal terminology that made her blood run cold. Her fingers unconsciously traced the outline of her law degree certificate, folded and tucked safely in her apron pocket, a reminder of dreams deferred but never abandoned. The head of legal, Margaret Holbrook, shuffled through a stack of papers with the frantic energy of someone drowning in complexity. Her reading glasses had slipped down her nose and perspiration beaded on her forehead despite the air conditioning that kept the executive floor at a constant 68 degrees. "The non-compete clauses we've been using are apparently unenforceable under the new state legislation, but that's not the worst part." Maya's grip tightened on the coffee pot's handle. She had read about the legislative changes 6 months ago in the legal journals she still subscribed to, even though she couldn't afford to maintain her bar association membership. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, serving coffee to lawyers who were missing legal developments she tracked religiously from her studio apartment. "What's the worst part?" Townsend asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The arbitration clauses," Margaret continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "They're claiming our mandatory arbitration agreements violate federal labor law. If they're right, we're not just looking at monetary damages. The Department of Labor could impose sanctions that would cripple our operations." The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of the HVAC system and the distant sounds of traffic 32 floors below. Maya had been working at Meridian Industries for 8 months, ever since the small law firm where she had been a junior associate was dissolved following the senior partner's sudden death. The transition from attorney to food service worker had been jarring, but bills didn't pause for career setbacks. She remembered her first day at the firm, how she had carefully hung her law degree on the wall of her tiny shared office, how she had felt the weight of possibility in every case file she touched. The degree had cost her 6 years of her life and $180,000 in student loans, but it represented more than education. It was proof that a first-generation immigrant could climb any mountain in America. "Maya, could you refresh everyone's coffee?" Margaret's voice cut through her reverie. "Of course," Maya replied, moving gracefully between the chairs with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to be invisible while seeing everything. As she poured Colombian roast into bone china cups, Maya listened to the attorneys dissect the legal challenges facing the company. Each point they raised confirmed her growing suspicions about the flaws in Meridian's employment practices. She had noticed inconsistencies in her own employment contract when she signed it, but had assumed the discrepancies were intentional, designed to favor the company in ways that skirted the edges of legality. "The plaintiff's brief is solid," admitted James Whitman, Meridian's outside counsel from the prestigious firm of Patterson and Associates. His Boston accent carried the authority of 3 decades practicing corporate law, but today it trembled with uncertainty. They've identified at least 7 clauses in our standard contract that violate recent changes to state employment law. Maya bit her tongue to keep from correcting the statement. The amendments hadn't been buried. They had been prominently featured in every major legal publication for months. She had highlighted them in her personal copy of the Federal Register, using the same yellow marker she had once used to study for the bar exam. The conversation continued around her as she completed her circuit of the table, each attorney adding their perspective to what was clearly a dire situation. The company faced not just financial ruin, but potential criminal liability if prosecutors decided to pursue charges of systematic labor law violations. "We need to find a way to demonstrate good faith," James suggested, loosening his tie as if it were a noose. "If we can show that we were attempting to comply with the law, even if we fell short, it might mitigate some of the damages." "How do we prove good faith when our contracts are riddled with illegal provisions?" Margaret asked. Maya felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same sensation she had experienced during law school moot court competitions when she spotted a crucial precedent that opposing counsel had overlooked. Her fingers traced the edge of her degree certificate again, feeling the raised seal of her law school beneath the fabric of her apron. "Maya, we'll need lunch orders in about an hour," Margaret said without looking up from her papers. "Of course, Miss Holbrook," Maya replied, but her mind was racing through employment law precedents and regulatory frameworks that could potentially save the company millions of dollars. As she left the conference room with her coffee service card, Maya caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished chrome elevator doors. The young woman staring back at her wore a black vest and weight shirt, her dark hair pulled back in the neat bun required by the catering company's dress code. But behind her eyes was the mind of an attorney who had graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown Law, who had passed the bar exam on her first attempt, and who understood the legal landscape these corporate lawyers were struggling to navigate. The elevator descended toward the kitchen floors, carrying with it the weight of Maya's internal conflict. She had sworn an oath to uphold justice and serve the law, but that oath seemed meaningless when she was serving sandwiches instead of serving justice. Yet somewhere in the complexity of Meridian's legal crisis, she sensed an opportunity, not just for the company, but for herself. The question that haunted her as she prepared lunch orders wasn't whether she could help solve their legal problems. The question was whether she was brave enough to step out of the shadows and reclaim the professional identity she had been forced to abandon. Maya's alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m., the same time it had buzzed every morning for the past 8 months. The sound cut through the darkness of her studio apartment like a blade, sharp and unforgiving, pulling her from dreams where she still wore tailored suits and argued cases before federal judges. She rolled over on the Murphy bed that dominated the small space, her hand automatically reaching for her phone to silence the noise that marked another day of serving others instead of serving justice. The apartment was a study in efficient poverty. Every item served multiple purposes. The fold-out table that transformed from dining surface to desk to ironing board, the storage ottoman that held her legal textbooks and doubled as a coffee table. The makeshift closet created from a tension rod and a bedsheet separated her professional uniforms from the business attire she no longer needed but couldn't bring herself to sell. Steam from her shower fogged the bathroom mirror, but Maya could still see the ghost of her former self in the reflection. She traced a finger along the glass, drawing the scales of justice in the condensation, a morning ritual that reminded her of who she used to be and who she still hoped to become again. The symbol would evaporate within minutes, but for those few seconds, it connected her to a world where her voice mattered. Her morning routine was choreographed with the precision of a legal brief. Coffee first, not the premium Colombian beans she served to executives, but instant crystals dissolved in tap water heated in a microwave that was older than her law degree. The bitter taste was a daily reminder of how far she had fallen, but also fuel for the determination that burned quietly in her chest. While her coffee cooled, Maya would spend 20 minutes reading legal news on her laptop, a ritual she had maintained even when she couldn't afford much else. Today's headlines included updates on employment law enforcement actions and a feature story about wage theft settlements that made her think about the conversation she had overheard in the Meridian conference room. The eviction notice had come 30 days after the firm closed, written on the same type of legal letterhead she had once used to threaten deadbeat tenants on behalf of corporate clients. The final neighborhood was where Meridian Industries' tower pierced the sky like a glass and steel monument to corporate power. Here, the sidewalks were cleaner, the trees were carefully maintained, and the people wore clothes that cost more than Maya made in a month. She had learned to make herself small in this world, to move with the practiced invisibility of service workers who kept the machinery of capitalism running smoothly. The employee entrance to Meridian Industries was in the building's basement, accessible through a loading dock that handled both freight deliveries and human resources. Maya badged in through a security turnstile that recorded her arrival time to the minute, feeding data into payroll systems that calculated her worth in hourly increments. The locker room where she changed into her uniform was a windowless space that smelled of industrial disinfectant and the accumulated hopes of people working jobs that paid the bills but didn't fulfill the soul. Her locker was number 247, a metal rectangle that contained her civilian clothes and a small mirror where she would adjust her appearance for another day of professional invisibility. "Morning, Maya," called Sarah Rodriguez, a fellow server who had been working at Meridian for 3 years. Sarah was in her 50s, with graying hair and laugh lines that spoke to a resilience Maya deeply admired. "Another day in paradise, right?" "Right," Maya replied, forcing a smile as she pinned her name tag to her vest. The plastic rectangle read simply, "Maya," in corporate-friendly font, stripping away her last name and any hint of her educational achievements or professional credentials. "You hear about the big meeting yesterday?" Sarah asked, lowering her voice to the conspiratorial whisper that all service workers mastered. "Word is, the company's in some kind of legal trouble, employment lawyers crawling all over the executive floors." Maya's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "I heard something about it. Do you know what kind of trouble?" "Contract problems, from what I gathered. Something about the agreements we all signed when we got hired. Could mean changes are coming." The irony was suffocating. Maya had signed the same flawed employment contract that was now threatening to destroy the company, but she was the only person in the building who understood the full scope of the legal violations it contained. She was simultaneously victim and potential savior, invisible and uniquely qualified to help. Their supervisor, Marcus Thompson, emerged from his office with the weary expression of a man managing 30 service workers on a budget designed for 20. Marcus was fair but overworked, caught between corporate demands for efficiency and the reality of running food service operations in a building where a single catering event could feed 300 people. "Morning briefing," Marcus called out, and the assembled workers gathered around him in the break area. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in the harsh blue-white glow that made everyone look slightly sick. "We've got a full schedule today," Marcus began, consulting a tablet that contained their assignments. "Executive floor meetings all morning, department lunches, and a client event this evening. Maya, you'll be on the 32nd floor for the legal department meetings. Sarah, you've got the marketing presentations on 28. Maya nodded, her mind already racing through the implications of another day serving the lawyers who were struggling with problems she could solve. The frustration was becoming harder to contain, like pressure building in a sealed container with no release valve. As the briefing concluded and workers dispersed to begin their day, Maya found herself alone with Marcus for a moment. "You okay, Maya?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying genuine concern. "You've seemed distracted lately." "I'm fine," Maya replied automatically, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Look, I know this job isn't what you expected when you took it. We all got stories about how we ended up here. But you bring something different to the work, the way you carry yourself, the way you handle the difficult clients. It's like you understand their world in a way most of us don't." If only he knew, Maya thought. If only any of them knew that she didn't just understand the corporate world, she had been trained to navigate it, to shape it, to use the law as a tool for justice or profit, depending on which side retained her services. "I appreciate that, Marcus. I'll see you after the morning service." The service elevator that carried her to the 32nd floor was the same one she had ridden yesterday, But today, it felt different. Today, she wasn't just delivering coffee and clearing plates. Today, she was carrying with her the weight of knowledge that could save or damn the company that employed her. As the elevator climbed, Maya closed her eyes and recited the oath she had taken when she was sworn in as an attorney. I will support the Constitution and laws of the United States and of this state. I will maintain the respect due to courts of justice and judicial officers. I will not counsel or maintain any suit or proceeding which shall appear to me to be unjust, nor any defense except such as I believe to be honestly debatable under the law of the land. The elevator doors opened, revealing the executive hallway with its marble floors and oil paintings of company founders. Maya stepped out, carrying her service cart and her secret knowledge, still invisible, but no longer powerless. The question that had kept her awake the previous night returned with renewed urgency. How long could she remain silent while watching others struggle with problems she was uniquely qualified to solve? And what would it cost her, professionally, personally, emotionally, to step out of the shadows and reclaim her voice? The morning of Maya's third day observing the legal crisis unfolded with the mechanical precision of corporate routine. But beneath the surface, tension crackled like electricity before a storm. She wheeled her service cart through the executive corridors, past walls lined with photographs of Meridian Industries' proudest achievements, the renewable energy plant in Nevada, the affordable housing development in Detroit, the scholarship program that had sent over 200 underprivileged students to college. Each image served as a painful reminder of what was at stake. This wasn't just a corporation facing financial difficulties. It was an institution that provided livelihoods for thousands of employees and services that benefited entire communities. The legal crisis threatening to destroy it all had roots that went deeper than simple contract violations. Maya entered Conference Room A at precisely 7:30 a.m., beginning her silent choreography of setting up for another emergency meeting. The room held the lingering scent of yesterday's desperation, stale coffee, leather-bound anxiety, and the metallic taste of fear that seemed to emanate from the polished surfaces of expensive furniture. Richard Townsend arrived first, his appearance more disheveled than the previous day. His usually immaculate appearance had given way to wrinkled shirts and stubble that spoke of nights spent reviewing documents instead of sleeping. He acknowledged Maya with a distracted nod before settling into his chair at the head of the table, where he immediately began scrolling through messages on his phone with the manic energy of someone searching for salvation in digital communications. "Maya, could you make sure we have extra coffee this morning?" Townsend asked without looking up. "It's going to be a long day." "Of course, Mr. Townsend," Maya replied, noting the tremor in his voice that hadn't been there a week ago. Margaret Holbrook entered next, carrying an armload of documents that she dropped onto the conference table with a thud that seemed to echo through the room. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a hasty ponytail, and her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck, a detail that made her look older and more vulnerable than her position as head of legal affairs typically allowed. The plaintiff's attorneys filed additional motions overnight. They're expanding their claims to include violations of the Fair Labor Standards Act and seeking punitive damages. James Whitman from Patterson & Associates arrived carrying his own collection of legal documents, but his confident Boston bearing had been replaced by the hunched shoulders of defeat. He had built his career on successfully defending corporations against employment claims, but this case seemed to be dismantling his professional reputation, one filing at a time. "How many employees are we talking about now?" Townsend asked, finally looking up from his phone. 12,437, Margaret replied, with the precision of someone who had been counting potential casualties. Maya's hand stilled on the coffee pot as she processed the number. More than 12,000 people whose employment agreements contained the same illegal clauses she had identified in her own contract. The scope of the potential liability was staggering, not just in monetary terms, but in human impact. "What's our total exposure if we lose on all counts?" Townsend asked. James consulted his notes, his pen trembling slightly as he traced the calculations. Conservative estimate? $250 million in damages. That's not counting attorney fees, regulatory fines, or potential criminal penalties. The room fell silent, except for the whisper of Maya's movements as she continued setting up the coffee service. She had learned to make herself invisible during these moments of corporate crisis, but her mind was cataloging every detail, every legal misstep, every opportunity for resolution that the assembled attorneys were missing. "There has to be something we can do," Townsend said, his voice cracking with the desperation of someone watching a life's work crumble. "Some precedent? Some procedural defense? Some way to demonstrate good faith?" "The problem is systematic," James replied. "These aren't innocent mistakes. The illegal clauses were templates that were used consistently across all employment contracts. It suggests intentional disregard for employment law." Maya bit her tongue to keep from correcting his analysis. The clauses weren't intentionally illegal, they were outdated. The employment law landscape had shifted dramatically over the past 2 years, with new federal regulations and state amendments that had rendered previously standard contract language unenforceable. A competent legal review would have identified and corrected these issues months ago. "What about settlement?" Margaret asked. "If we approach this proactively, maybe we can control the damages?" "They're not interested in settlement. Their attorneys smell blood in the water. They want to take this to trial and make an example of us." The door opened, and several department heads entered the room, called in to discuss the operational implications of the legal crisis. Maya recognized most of them from previous meetings. Jennifer Walsh from Human Resources, whose tired eyes reflected the burden of having processed thousands of potentially invalid employment contracts. David Park from Operations, who would be responsible for implementing whatever changes emerged from the legal battle, and Sandra Martinez from Finance, who would have to calculate the cost of corporate survival. "The situation is this. We're facing a legal challenge that could destroy the company. Every employment contract we've signed in the past 5 years contains provisions that may be illegal under current law." Jennifer Walsh raised her hand tentatively. "What does this mean for our current employees? Are their contracts still valid?" "That's unclear," Margaret admitted. "The illegal clauses could void the entire agreements, which would leave us without any contractual relationship with our workforce." "So we could lose our entire employee base overnight?" David Park asked, his voice rising with alarm. "It's possible," James confirmed. "If the contracts are ruled invalid, employees would be free to leave without notice, and we would have no legal recourse to enforce non-compete agreements or recover training investments." Maya felt a familiar surge of frustration as she listened to the conversation spiraling into pessimism. The attorneys were focusing on worst-case scenarios without exploring the legal frameworks that could provide solutions. Employment law contained provisions for contract reformation, good faith compliance efforts, and transitional agreements that could protect both the company and its workers during a legal restructuring process. "What about our clients?" Sandra Martinez asked. "If word gets out that we're facing this kind of legal challenge, we could lose major contracts." "The client retention team is already fielding questions. Some of our biggest accounts are conducting their own legal reviews of our relationship agreements. If they find similar problems, we're looking at a complete corporate collapse." The weight of the moment settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Maya continued her service duties, but her movements had become mechanical as her mind worked through the legal complexities that none of the assembled attorneys seemed capable of navigating. "There has to be someone who can help us," Townsend said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some expert who understands this area of law better than we do." Employment law has become incredibly specialized. The firms that handle these kinds of cases charge premium rates, and most of them are already representing plaintiffs against companies like ours. Maya paused in her service duties, her hand gripping the pot's handle so tightly her knuckles went white.
She was listening to a room full of attorneys admit they were out of their depth in an area of law where she had specialized during her brief but intensive career. The irony was suffocating. The expertise they desperately needed was standing 3 feet away, wearing a server's uniform and invisible to their crisis-clouded perception.
What about internal resources? Jennifer Walsh suggested. Are there any employees in the company who have legal backgrounds? We've reviewed personnel files, Margaret replied. Most of our legal staff are corporate attorneys with limited employment law experience. We don't have anyone with the specialized knowledge needed to navigate this crisis. Maya's breath caught in her throat. They had reviewed personnel files, but hadn't found her because her law degree wasn't listed in her employment record with the catering company. She was a contractor, not a direct employee, invisible not just socially, but administratively. The hearing is scheduled for next Friday, James announced, consulting his calendar. Judge Morrison is known for moving quickly through employment cases. If we don't have a solid defense strategy by then, we're finished, Townsend concluded. As the meeting continued, Maya found herself caught between professional duty and personal survival. Every fiber of her legal training screamed at her to speak up, to offer the expertise that could save the company and its employees. But doing so would mean revealing her true qualifications, acknowledging that she had been working below her education level and risking the modest stability she had managed to build in the wake of professional disaster. The internal conflict was becoming unbearable. She thought about her immigrant parents who had sacrificed everything to give her educational opportunities they never had. She thought about her law school classmates, many of whom were now partners at prestigious firms while she served coffee to executives. She thought about the oath she had taken as an attorney, the promise to serve justice even when it came at personal cost. "Maya, could you refresh everyone's water glasses?" Margaret asked, interrupting her internal struggle. "Of course," Maya replied, but her voice carried a tension that hadn't been there before. As she moved around the table, filling glasses with ice water, Maya made a decision that would change everything. She would give them one more opportunity to recognize her value, to see past the uniform to the expertise that could save them all. If they missed that opportunity, she would take matters into her own hands. The morning meeting concluded with no resolution, only deepening despair and mounting pressure. As the executives and attorneys filed out of the conference room, Maya began clearing the table with methodical precision. But this time, she left behind something that hadn't been there before. A single sheet of paper, folded once and tucked under Margaret Holbrook's coffee cup. On that paper, written in the careful handwriting she had developed during law school, was a single sentence that would transform the crisis from unsolvable to merely complex. The employment contracts can be reformed under Section 8C of the Federal Employment Standards Act if the company demonstrates proactive compliance efforts within 30 days of discovery. Maya left the conference room without looking back, but her heart was racing with the knowledge that she had just lit a fuse that would either save the company or destroy her carefully constructed invisibility. The discovery of Maya's note created a ripple effect that began with Margaret Holbrook's sharp intake of breath and spread outward like concentric circles in a disturbed pond. Margaret had been gathering her papers after the morning meeting when her fingers brushed against the folded sheet tucked beneath her coffee cup. The handwriting was elegant, confident, the kind of penmanship that spoke of careful education and professional training. Section 8C of the Federal Employment Standards Act, she murmured to herself, her legal mind immediately recognizing the significance of the reference. She had been practicing employment law for 15 years, but the specific subsection mentioned in the note addressed a relatively obscure provision for contract reformation that she had never needed to use. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone and began researching the cited statute. Within minutes, she was deep in the legal database, reading through provisions that could potentially provide Meridian Industries with the lifeline they desperately needed. The note was accurate. Section 8C did provide a framework for reforming contracts that contained unenforceable provisions, but only under very specific circumstances and with extremely tight deadlines. "James, you need to see this," Margaret called out, her voice carrying down the hallway with an urgency that made several assistants look up from their desks. James Whitman was in the elevator when Margaret caught him, waving the piece of paper like a banner of hope. His tired eyes focused on the note, scanning the legal citation with the practiced deficiency of someone who had built a career on finding obscure precedents in desperate situations. "Where did this come from?" James asked, his Boston accent sharpening with interest. "I found it in the conference room after the meeting. Someone left it under my coffee cup," Margaret replied, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and confusion. "Do you think it's legitimate?" James was already pulling out his phone, accessing the same legal databases that had consumed much of his attention for the past week. Section 8C. Here it is. An employer may seek reformation of employment contracts containing unenforceable provisions if the employer can demonstrate good faith compliance efforts initiated within 30 days of discovery of the violations. "That's exactly what we need," Margaret breathed, her exhaustion temporarily forgotten in the face of potential salvation. "But who wrote this note?" James asked, studying the handwriting as if it might reveal its author's identity. "This isn't common knowledge. Whoever left this has significant expertise in federal employment law." Margaret's mind was racing through possibilities. The handwriting didn't match any of the attorneys on their team, and the knowledge demonstrated was too specialized for a casual observer. "We need to find out who wrote this note, immediately." The investigation began with Margaret questioning everyone who had been in the conference room during the morning meeting. Richard Townsend was baffled by the discovery, his exhausted mind struggling to process yet another unexpected development in an already surreal crisis. The department heads who had attended the meeting were equally mystified. None of them possessed the legal expertise necessary to identify such an obscure statutory provision. "Could it have been someone from outside counsel?" Townsend asked, grasping for logical explanations. "All of our outside attorneys were in the room during the entire meeting. No one left anything behind, and frankly, none of us were aware of this particular provision." The mystery deepened when Margaret began questioning the support staff who had access to the conference room. The custodial team worked overnight shifts and hadn't been in the building during the meeting. The security guards had no reason to enter the executive conference areas during business hours. The only service personnel present during the meeting had been the catering staff, Margaret said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of realization. There was a server in the room during the entire meeting, young woman, Asian American, very professional demeanor. "You think a waitress wrote this note?" James asked, his tone skeptical but not dismissive. "You think someone with legal training wrote this note," Margaret corrected. "The question is why that person was serving coffee instead of practicing law." Margaret's investigation led her to Marcus Thompson's office in the basement level of the building where the catering operations were managed. Marcus looked up from his scheduling tablet with surprise when Margaret appeared at his door. Executive-level staff rarely ventured into the service areas of the building. "Miss Holbrook," Marcus said, rising from his desk with the deference that corporate hierarchies demanded, "how can I help you?" "I need information about one of your staff members," Margaret began, choosing her words carefully. "The young woman who was serving in conference room A this morning, Asian American, very professional presentation." "That would be Maya Chen. She's one of our best servers, always punctual, handles the executive accounts with perfect discretion." "How long has she been working here?" "About 8 months. She came to us through the temp agency after some kind of career transition." "Why? Is there a problem with her service?" Margaret paused, considering how much to reveal. "No problem with her service. Actually, the opposite. I need to speak with her as soon as possible. Is she working today?"
She's on the 28th floor right now, serving lunch for the marketing department meetings. Should I call her down? Yes, Margaret said, her heart racing with anticipation and hope.
Maya sat carefully, her hands folded in her lap, maintaining the deferential posture that service workers were expected to adopt in the presence of corporate leadership. But her eyes were alert, intelligent, and Margaret found herself studying the young woman's face with new attention. "I want to ask you about something that was left in conference room A this morning," Margaret began, placing the handwritten note on her desk where Maya could see it. "Do you know anything about this?" Maya's expression didn't change, but Margaret caught the slightest tightening around her eyes, the look of someone who had been expecting this conversation but hoped it wouldn't come. "I clean the conference rooms after meetings," Maya said carefully. "I might have seen papers left behind." "This isn't just any paper," Margaret continued, leaning forward in her chair. "This is a highly specific legal citation that directly addresses the employment law crisis our company is facing. Whoever wrote this has extensive knowledge of federal employment statutes." Maya remained silent, but her fingers unconsciously moved toward her apron pocket, the same gesture Margaret had noticed during the morning meeting, when Maya had seemed to be touching something hidden in her uniform. "Maya," said Margaret gently, "I need you to be honest with me. Did you write this note?" For a long moment, the office was silent, except for the whisper of air conditioning and the distant sounds of traffic from the street below. Maya looked down at her hands, then back up at Margaret with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of months of hidden frustration. "Yes," said Maya quietly. "I wrote the note." Margaret felt a surge of vindication mixed with curiosity. "How do you know about Section 8C of the Federal Employment Standards Act?" Maya reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, her law degree certificate, worn from handling but still bearing the official seal of Georgetown University Law Center. She unfolded it carefully and placed it on Margaret's desk next to the handwritten note. "Because I'm an attorney," Maya said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I graduated summa cum laude from Georgetown Law 3 years ago. I passed the District of Columbia bar exam on my first attempt. I specialized in employment law during my final year of law school, and I worked as a junior associate at Patterson, Hughes & Associates until the firm dissolved 8 months ago." Margaret stared at the degree certificate, her legal mind processing the implications of what Maya had just revealed. Patterson, Hughes & Associates. That was David Patterson's firm. I knew David. He was brilliant, but erratic. When he died, the firm closed within 2 weeks. There were no provisions for transitioning cases or protecting junior associates. I lost my job, my health insurance, and my professional references all at once. "And you ended up serving coffee," Margaret said, not as a question, but as a statement of recognition for how quickly professional lives could unravel. "I ended up trying to survive," Maya corrected gently. "The legal job market was tight, my student loan payments were crushing, and I needed income immediately. The catering job was supposed to be temporary while I found another position in law." Margaret was silent for several moments, studying Maya's face as if seeing her for the first time. The revelation recontextualized everything: her professional demeanor, her careful attention to detail, the way she seemed to understand the corporate environment with an insider's perspective rather than a service worker's deference. "You've been listening to our legal discussions for months. You've known about the problems with our employment contracts. I identified the issues in my own contract the day I signed it, but I assumed they were intentional, designed to favor the company in ways that pushed legal boundaries without crossing them. It wasn't until I heard yesterday's meeting that I realized the scope of the problem." "And you said nothing?" Margaret asked, her tone carrying more curiosity than accusation. Maya's expression tightened with the memory of months spent biting her tongue. "What was I supposed to say? I was a waitress serving coffee to lawyers who were supposedly experts in corporate law. Who would have believed that I had knowledge they lacked? And even if they had believed me, revealing my background would have meant admitting that I was overqualified for my position, which could have cost me the only job I could find. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her mind racing through the implications of Maya's revelation. But you decided to help anyway. Why? Because 12,000 people are going to lose their jobs if this company collapses, Maya said, her voice carrying the passion that had first drawn her to law school. Because justice isn't served when good companies are destroyed by legal technicalities that could have been prevented with proper compliance. And because, she paused, struggling with the personal admission, because I took an oath to serve justice even when it's inconvenient. Margaret picked up Maya's law degree certificate, examining the official seals and signatures that validated her qualifications. Georgetown Law, that's not an easy school. You must have been an exceptional student. I was hungry, Maya replied simply. My parents immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but hope and determination. They worked multiple jobs to put me through college, believing that education was the key to opportunities they never had. I couldn't let them down. And now you're serving coffee to pay off the student loans from that education, Margaret observed, the irony not lost on her. The monthly payment is $1,847, Maya said quietly. The catering job pays enough to cover rent, food, and loan payments, but nothing extra. I've been telling myself it's temporary, but temporary has stretched into 8 months with no end in sight. Margaret stood and walked to her office window, looking out at the city skyline while processing everything Maya had revealed. Below, people moved through the streets like insects, each carrying their own hidden stories of triumph and struggle. How many other overqualified workers were invisible in service positions, their expertise hidden behind uniforms and presumptions? Maya, Margaret said, turning back from the window, I need to ask you something important. How familiar are you with the specific employment law issues we're facing? Maya's posture straightened, her professional bearing replacing the deferential stance she had maintained as a service worker. Very familiar. I've read through the plaintiff's briefs. They're available in the public court records. I've researched the case law precedents they're citing. I've analyzed your standard employment contract language and identified not just the 7 violations they've mentioned, but 12 additional problematic clauses that haven't been challenged yet. Margaret's eyes widened. 12 additional violations? The non-disclosure agreements contain language that violates the National Labor Relations Act, Maya began, her voice taking on the confident tone of a legal professional presenting analysis. The compensation structures fail to comply with updated overtime regulations. The benefits provisions contain discriminatory language that violates the Equal Employment Opportunity Act. And the termination clauses include penalties that constitute illegal wage garnishment under federal law. My God, Margaret breathed, sinking back into her chair. If the plaintiffs discover those additional violations, the damage awards could exceed $500 million, Maya finished. But that's not the worst part. The Department of Labor would be required to initiate criminal proceedings against company leadership for willful violations of federal employment law. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she processed the full scope of the legal disaster they were facing. You're telling me this situation is even worse than we realized? Much worse, Maya confirmed, but also much more solvable than you've been led to believe. What do you mean? Maya leaned forward in her chair, her exhaustion from months of serving coffee replaced by the energized focus of an attorney who had found a complex problem worthy of her skills. The Section 8C provision I mentioned in my note is just the beginning. Federal employment law contains multiple frameworks for companies that proactively address compliance issues. If Meridian acts quickly and demonstrates good faith efforts to reform its employment practices, most of the potential damages can be mitigated. How quickly? The 30-day window starts from the date of discovery. Since yesterday's meeting was the first time company leadership explicitly acknowledged the violations, we have 29 days to implement comprehensive compliance reforms. Margaret grabbed a legal pad and began taking notes with the frantic energy of someone who had just been thrown a lifeline. What kind of reforms? Complete revision of all employment contracts using current legal standards, Maya began, her mind organizing a comprehensive strategy. Voluntary renegotiation of existing agreements with enhanced benefits to demonstrate good faith. Implementation of new compliance monitoring systems. Establishment of an employee advocacy program. And, most importantly, full cooperation with the Department of Labor's investigation to show institutional commitment to legal compliance. That sounds like months of work, Margaret said, her hope beginning to dim again. It would be months of work for attorneys who aren't familiar with employment law compliance frameworks, Maya corrected. But I've been studying these issues intensively for the past 8 months. I know exactly which provisions need to be changed, which precedents to cite, and which regulatory procedures to follow. With the right support, I could have a comprehensive compliance plan drafted within 72 hours. Margaret stared at Maya, her legal mind struggling to process the dramatic shift in their circumstances. You're saying you could solve this crisis? Single-handedly? I'm saying I could provide the expertise needed to solve it. Implementation would require a team effort, but the legal framework is well established if you know where to look. The office fell silent as Margaret grappled with the implications of Maya's offer. Here was a solution to their legal crisis, offered by someone who had been invisible to their corporate hierarchy, but possessed exactly the specialized knowledge they desperately needed. "Why should I trust you?" Margaret asked, finally, the question carrying no malice, but the professional skepticism that had kept her successful in corporate law. Maya reached into her other apron pocket and withdrew a folded stack of papers. "Because I've already started working on the solution," she said, unfolding what proved to be a detailed legal memorandum. "This is a preliminary analysis of Meridian's employment law compliance issues with specific recommendations for addressing each violation. I wrote it last night after overhearing yesterday's meeting." Margaret took the memorandum and began reading, her eyebrows rising as she processed the sophisticated legal analysis contained in the handwritten document. The writing was clear, the research was thorough, and the recommendations were precisely targeted to address the specific challenges Meridian was facing. This is exceptional work," Margaret admitted, looking up at Maya with new respect. "This is the kind of analysis I would expect from a senior associate at a top-tier firm." "I am a senior associate," Maya said quietly. "I just haven't been practicing law for the past 8 months. Margaret stood and began pacing her office, her mind racing through the possibilities and complications of Maya's offer. "If we bring you onto the legal team, there will be questions. How do we explain hiring a catering server as our lead employment law specialist?" "You don't hire a catering server," Maya replied with a slight smile. "You hire an attorney who happens to have been working in food service while looking for opportunities to return to legal practice." "The other attorneys will be skeptical," Margaret warned. "James Whitman has 30 years of experience. Richard Townsend built this company based on careful vetting of professional credentials." "Then let my work speak for itself," Maya said with her confidence growing with each exchange. "Give me 24 hours to draft a complete compliance strategy. If it meets your standards, we move forward. If it doesn't, I go back to serving coffee and pretend this conversation never happened." Margaret considered the offer, weighing the potential risks against the catastrophic consequences of continuing on their current path. The legal crisis was accelerating beyond their ability to manage it, and traditional solutions had proven inadequate. Maya represented an unconventional resource, but her expertise seemed genuine, and her analysis had already provided insights that their existing legal team had missed. "There's something else," Margaret said finally. "If we do this, if we bring you onto the legal team, what happens to your student loans, to your financial situation?" Maya's professional composure faltered slightly, revealing the vulnerability that months of financial struggle had created. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can't afford to turn down the catering income without a guaranteed alternative, but I can't continue watching legal problems I could solve while pretending to be just another service worker."
Margaret made a decision that would transform not just Maya's life, but potentially save the company and protect thousands of jobs. "Maya Chen," she said formally, "I'm offering you a position as special counsel for employment law compliance, effective immediately. Your starting salary will be $180,000 per year, with full benefits and a $25,000 signing bonus to address your immediate financial needs." Maya's hands began to tremble as the magnitude of the offer sank in. After 8 months of serving coffee and struggling to pay rent, she was being offered not just a return to legal practice, but a senior position with compensation that exceeded what she had earned as a junior associate. "Are you serious?" Maya whispered, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of relief and gratitude.
"I'm dead serious," Margaret replied. "This company is facing the biggest legal crisis in its history, and you may be our only hope of survival. The question is, are you ready to stop serving coffee and start practicing law again?" Maya stood from her chair, pulled off her server's apron, and extended her hand to Margaret with the confidence of someone who had just reclaimed her professional identity. "I've been ready for 8 months," she said. "Let's save this company." The transformation began at dawn the following morning, when Maya arrived at Meridian Industries not through the basement service entrance, but through the marble-clad main lobby where her heels clicked against polished floors with the confident rhythm of someone who belonged in the corporate tower's upper reaches. She wore her best suit, the charcoal gray Armani she had purchased for her law school graduation and hadn't worn since her last day at Patterson Hughes & Associates. The fabric felt foreign against her skin after months of polyester uniforms, but it carried the weight of professional authority she had missed more than she realized. Margaret Holbrook was waiting for her in the executive elevator, holding a leather portfolio and wearing an expression of cautious optimism that had replaced the despair of the previous week. "Ready for your first day back in practice?" Margaret asked as the elevator climbed toward floors Maya had only seen as a service worker. "I never stopped practicing. I just wasn't getting paid for it." The 34th floor housed Meridian's legal department in a suite of offices that Maya had only glimpsed through doorways while delivering coffee service. Now she was being led to a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a mahogany desk that could seat 8 people for conferences, and walls lined with legal volumes that she would finally have reason to consult. "This is your office," Margaret announced, gesturing to the space with obvious pride. "I know it's a significant upgrade from serving coffee in conference rooms," Maya finished with a wry smile. "Margaret, 3 days ago I was worried about making rent. This morning I'm looking at an office that's larger than my entire apartment." "You've earned it," Margaret said firmly, "and now you need to prove that our faith in your expertise is justified." Maya set her portfolio on the desk and opened it to reveal the fruit of her sleepless night, a comprehensive legal strategy that would either save Meridian Industries or demonstrate that the situation was beyond salvation. The document was 47 pages of detailed analysis, precedent citations, and step-by-step implementation procedures that represented everything she had learned about employment law during her formal education and months of involuntary research. "The Meridian Compliance Initiative," Maya announced, using the formal title she had given her plan. "A comprehensive strategy for transforming our legal crisis into a competitive advantage." Margaret sat in one of the client chairs and began reviewing the document, her eyebrows rising as she processed the sophistication of Maya's analysis. "Competitive advantage? Maya, we're facing potential bankruptcy. How does that become an advantage?" "Because we're going to become the gold standard for employment law compliance. Instead of just fixing our legal problems, we're going to create a compliance framework that other companies will want to emulate." Maya moved to the whiteboard that covered one wall of her new office and began sketching a flowchart that illustrated her strategy. Phase 1. Immediate crisis mitigation. We use the Section 8C provision to initiate voluntary contract reformation for all affected employees. This demonstrates good faith and starts the 30-day compliance clock. How do we handle 12,000 employees simultaneously? Maya asked, her practical experience in corporate operations raising logistical concerns. We don't do it simultaneously, Maya replied, continuing her diagram. We prioritize based on legal risk and employee impact. Senior executives first, their contracts contain the most problematic clauses and carry the highest potential damages, then department heads, then general employee population in manageable cohorts. What about the employees who don't want to renegotiate their contracts? Maya had anticipated this question during her planning process. Federal law requires that contract reformation be voluntary, but it also provides incentives for participation. We offer enhanced benefits, improved job security provisions, and expanded professional development opportunities to employees who agreed to the new contract terms. Margaret was taking notes as Maya continued her presentation, but she looked up with concern. Enhanced benefits will be expensive. Can the company afford to increase compensation while facing potential legal damages? The enhanced benefits will cost approximately $12 million annually, Maya replied, having calculated the financial implications with the precision of someone who understood both legal requirements and corporate budgets. The potential legal damages we're avoiding exceed $250 million. It's the most cost-effective legal strategy the company could implement. Margaret nodded, but her expression remained cautious. What about the plaintiffs who have already filed suit? Will this strategy address their claims? Maya moved to a second whiteboard and began outlining the litigation strategy that formed Phase 2 of her plan. The Voluntary Compliance Initiative demonstrates that Meridian is proactively addressing the legal issues that prompted the lawsuit. Federal employment law provides for reduced damages when companies show good faith efforts to remedy violations. How much reduction are we talking about? If we implement comprehensive reforms within the 30-day window, potential damages could be reduced by 70 to 80%, Maya replied. Instead of facing bankruptcy, we're looking at a manageable settlement that allows the company to continue operations while compensating affected employees fairly. Margaret set down her pen and looked at Maya with an expression of amazement. You developed this entire strategy in one night? I've been developing it for 8 months, Maya corrected. Every time I served coffee to legal meetings, every time I heard attorneys discussing employment law issues they didn't fully understand, every time I saw preventable legal problems being ignored, I was mentally cataloging solutions. Last night, I finally had permission to write them down. The office door opened and Richard Townsend entered, accompanied by James Whitman and several other members of the legal team. Townsend looked better than he had in days. His hair was combed, his suit was pressed, and his expression carried hope instead of despair. Maya, Townsend said, extending his hand with the warmth of someone greeting a lifeline. Margaret has told me about your background and your strategy. I have to admit I'm skeptical about hiring someone who was serving coffee 3 days ago, but I'm desperate enough to consider any reasonable solution. I understand your skepticism, Mr. Townsend, Maya replied, maintaining eye contact with the confidence of someone who knew her expertise was genuine. 3 days ago, I was serving coffee because I needed to pay my rent, but I was also analyzing every legal discussion I overheard and identifying solutions to problems your existing team couldn't solve. My circumstances changed, but my qualifications didn't. James Whitman stepped forward. His Boston accent carried a note of professional curiosity. I've reviewed your preliminary analysis, and I have to admit it's impressive, but employment law compliance is more than just theoretical knowledge. It requires practical experience with regulatory agencies, court procedures, and corporate implementation strategies. Maya had expected this challenge and was prepared with a response that demonstrated both her legal knowledge and her understanding of corporate politics. You're absolutely right, James. Theoretical knowledge alone isn't sufficient. That's why Phase 3 of my strategy includes partnerships with established employment law firms, collaboration with Department of Labor compliance specialists, and a gradual implementation timeline that allows for course corrections based on practical experience. Phase 3,
Townsend asked, settling into a chair as Maya returned to her whiteboard presentation. Long-term competitive positioning, Maya announced, beginning a new diagram that illustrated how Meridian's compliance crisis could be transformed into a market advantage. Once we've resolved the immediate legal issues and implemented comprehensive employment law reforms, we use our compliance expertise as a business development tool. The room fell silent as Maya continued her explanation, outlining how Meridian could market itself as the premier employer in their industry, attracting top talent through superior employment practices and winning client contracts by demonstrating corporate responsibility. Companies are increasingly concerned about the employment practices of their vendors and partners. Environmental, social, and governance criteria are becoming standard in contract evaluations. Our comprehensive compliance framework becomes a competitive differentiator that helps us win business while protecting us from future legal challenges. Margaret set down her pen and looked at Maya with an expression of growing excitement. "You're proposing that we turn our legal crisis into a marketing advantage?"
I'm proposing that we turn our legal compliance into a core business competency, Maya clarified. Employment law will only become more complex as federal and state regulations continue evolving. Companies that stay ahead of these changes will thrive. Companies that react after problems emerge will struggle to survive. Townsend leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he processed the implications of Maya's strategy. This is ambitious, maybe too ambitious. We're talking about completely transforming how the company approaches employment law, human resources, and corporate governance. We're talking about survival, Maya replied simply. The old approach to employment law, using standard contract templates and hoping for the best, doesn't work in today's regulatory environment. The companies that thrive in the next decade will be the ones that treat legal compliance as a strategic advantage, not a necessary evil. James Whitman had been quietly reviewing Maya's written analysis during the presentation, and now he looked up with grudging admiration. "I have to admit, this is the most comprehensive employment law strategy I've seen in 30 years of practice. It's ambitious, it's expensive, and it's probably our only hope of avoiding catastrophic damages." "What's our timeline for implementation?" Townsend asked, his tone indicating that he was moving from skepticism to acceptance. Maya turned to a fresh section of the whiteboard and began outlining the critical path for implementing her strategy. Phase 1 begins today. We need to file preliminary compliance documents with the Department of Labor by Friday to establish our good faith timeline. Contract reformation begins next Monday with executive leadership, then cascades through the organization over the following 3 weeks. "And if it doesn't work?" Margaret asked, her practical concerns returning. "Then we've spent 3 weeks and approximately $2 million demonstrating that we attempted every reasonable solution," Maya replied honestly. "But the alternative is continuing on our current path, which leads to certain bankruptcy within 6 months. Townsend stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city while contemplating a decision that would determine the fate of his company and the livelihoods of thousands of employees. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before he turned back to the assembled group. "Maya," he said formally, "I'm authorizing you to implement your compliance strategy. You'll have full authority over employment law matters, unlimited access to company resources, and my complete support in dealing with any internal resistance to the changes you're proposing." Maya felt a surge of vindication mixed with overwhelming responsibility. After 8 months of professional invisibility, she was being entrusted with the legal survival of a major corporation. "Thank you, Mr. Townsend. I won't let you down." "You better not," Townsend replied with a slight smile. "Because if this doesn't work, we'll all be looking for new jobs together." As the meeting concluded and the executives filed out of Maya's new office, Margaret lingered behind to discuss the practical details of implementation. The magnitude of the task ahead was daunting, but for the first time in months, Maya felt the energizing rush of meaningful work that matched her qualifications and ambitions. "There's one more thing," Margaret said as she prepared to leave. "The story of your hiring is going to spread through the company quickly. People are going to be curious about the waitress who became our chief compliance officer." Maya considered this, understanding the implications for both her professional credibility and the morale of other service workers in the building. "Let them be curious," she replied. "Maybe it will remind everyone that expertise comes in many forms and that the people serving our coffee might have more to offer than we realize." That afternoon, Maya began the most challenging legal project of her career, working with a team of attorneys, human resources specialists, and corporate executives to implement a compliance strategy that either save Meridian Industries or provide a dignified path toward closure. The work was exhausting, exhilarating, and exactly what she had trained for during 6 years of legal education. As the sun set over the city, Maya stood at her office window, still amazed at the transformation that had occurred in less than 72 hours. 3 days ago, she was invisible, serving coffee and struggling to pay rent. Tonight, she was the architect of a legal strategy that could protect thousands of jobs and transform a corporate crisis into a competitive advantage. 6 months later. The Department of Labor compliance officer closed her laptop with a satisfied expression and turned to face Maya across the polished conference table. Sandra Williams had been investigating employment law violations for 15 years, and she had seen every type of corporate response to regulatory scrutiny, from complete denial to grudging minimal compliance. What she had found at Meridian Industries was unprecedented. "Miss Chen," Sandra said, her official tone softening with genuine admiration, "in my entire career, I have never seen a more comprehensive transformation of corporate employment practices. The Meridian Compliance Initiative has exceeded every federal requirement and established new benchmarks for industry best practices." Maya smiled, but her expression carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent 6 months rebuilding a company's legal foundation from the ground up. Her office wall now displayed both her Georgetown Law degree and a certificate of recognition from the Department of Labor, the first of many awards that would follow. "The credit belongs to the entire Meridian team," Maya replied diplomatically. "Corporate leadership provided unprecedented support, and employees at every level embraced changes that weren't always convenient or comfortable." The employee satisfaction surveys tell an interesting story. Job satisfaction increased by 37% during the implementation period. Voluntary turnover dropped to the lowest levels in company history, and you've received over 400 applications from employment law attorneys who want to join your compliance team. Maya nodded, remembering the skepticism that had greeted her initial hiring. Now, Meridian's legal department had grown from 5 attorneys to 18, with a waiting list of qualified candidates who wanted to work for a company that treated employment law as a strategic advantage rather than a regulatory burden. The transformation hadn't been easy. The first month had been particularly challenging, as Maya worked 18-hour days to implement contract reforms while managing the legal complexities of an ongoing federal investigation. There had been moments when the pressure seemed unbearable, when the magnitude of responsibility for thousands of jobs felt overwhelming. But the strategy had worked. The class action lawsuit that had threatened to bankrupt the company was settled for $47 million, a significant sum, but manageable within the context of Meridian's annual revenues. More importantly, the settlement included provisions that transformed former adversaries into advocates. The plaintiff's attorneys now recommended Meridian as an example of how companies should respond to employment law challenges. 2 years later, Maya stood at the podium of the American Bar Association's annual conference, looking out at an audience of over 1,000 employment law attorneys who had come to hear about the Meridian model that was transforming corporate compliance practices across the country.
Her presentation titled From Crisis to Competitive Advantage, Employment Law as Business Strategy had been one of the most requested sessions of the conference. When I began working on employment law compliance, Maya began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had proven her expertise through results rather than credentials. I was motivated by crisis. Today, I want to talk about how legal compliance can be motivated by opportunity. The audience was engaged, taking notes as Maya outlined the framework that had saved Meridian Industries and been adopted by over 200 companies in various industries. The transformation had become a case study taught in law schools, business schools, and corporate training programs around the world. In the front row, Margaret Holbrook smiled with the pride of a mentor who had recognized potential when others only saw a service worker. Margaret had been promoted to general counsel 6 months earlier, and she frequently told the story of how Maya's hidden expertise had saved the company from bankruptcy. After Maya's presentation, during the reception that followed, she was approached by dozens of attorneys, corporate executives, and legal scholars who wanted to discuss implementation strategies, regulatory frameworks, and the broader implications of treating compliance as competitive advantage. "Ms. Chen," said a young attorney who reminded Maya of herself 3 years earlier, eager, slightly overwhelmed, and hungry for opportunities to make a meaningful impact. "I'm a recent law school graduate working for a firm that specializes in employment law. Your story has inspired me to think differently about how legal expertise can create value beyond traditional practice models." Maya accepted the young woman's business card and studied her earnest expression. "What's your name?"
Jennifer Park, the attorney replied. "I graduated from Yale Law last year, but I'm struggling to find opportunities that match my interests in employment advocacy." Maya smiled, remembering her own struggles to find meaningful work that paid living wages. "Jennifer, would you be interested in joining our team at Meridian? We're expanding our compliance consulting division and looking for attorneys who understand that employment law is about protecting people, not just managing corporate risk." Jennifer's eyes widened with surprise and hope. "Are you serious? I would be honored to work with you." "Send me your resume and a writing sample," Maya replied, handing Jennifer her business card. "But more importantly, tell me about the employment law issue you care most about solving. We hire people who are passionate about making the legal system work better for everyone." 5 years later, the Harvard Business School case study had been assigned in corporate strategy courses for 3 consecutive semesters, and Maya was invited to participate in classroom discussions via video conference from her office at the Meridian Institute for Employment Law Innovation, a think tank and consulting organization that had grown out of the company's compliance division. "Ms. Chen," asked a second-year MBA student, "when you were serving coffee to executives who were struggling with legal problems you could solve, what prevented you from speaking up sooner?" Maya paused, considering the question that she had been asked in various forms hundreds of times over the past 5 years. "I think I was trapped by assumptions. My assumptions about how corporate hierarchies work, their assumptions about who possesses valuable expertise, and society's assumptions about the relationship between job titles and professional capability." "But you eventually found the courage to step forward," the professor interjected. "What changed?" "The stakes became too high for silence," Maya replied. "When I realized that 12,000 people might lose their jobs because of legal problems I understood how to solve, I couldn't continue prioritizing my own comfort over their welfare. Sometimes courage isn't about fearlessness. It's about deciding that other people's needs matter more than your own fears." The classroom discussion continued for another 20 minutes, but Maya's mind drifted to the broader implications of her story. The Meridian model had been implemented by companies in 37 states and 12 countries, protecting millions of workers from employment law violations while helping businesses transform compliance costs into competitive advantages. But the personal transformation had been equally significant. Maya's student loans were paid off, she owned a home,
and she had established a scholarship fund for first-generation college students pursuing legal careers. More importantly, she had learned that professional identity wasn't determined by job titles or workplace hierarchies, but the value someone could create when given the opportunity to contribute their best work. 10 years later, Maya stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, wearing the navy blue suit she had chosen specifically for this occasion, the Presidential Award for Innovation in Corporate Social Responsibility. The ceremony honored individuals and organizations that had demonstrably improved American workers' lives through innovative approaches to employment law and labor relations. The Meridian model has protected over 2 million American workers from employment law violations, the president announced to the assembled audience of business leaders, labor advocates, and policymakers. It has demonstrated that corporate responsibility and business success are not competing priorities, but complementary strategies that strengthen both companies and communities. Maya accepted the award with genuine humility, thinking about the unlikely journey that had brought her from serving coffee to receiving recognition from the President of the United States. But she also thought about Marcus Thompson, her former catering supervisor, who was now in the audience as the director of the Meridian's Employment Development Program. She thought about Sarah Rodriguez, who had completed her college degree with tuition assistance from the company's Expanded Education Benefits Program. This award belongs to everyone who believed that expertise should be recognized regardless of where it's found. And it belongs to everyone who has the courage to step forward when they have knowledge that could help others, even when it means risking the safety of silence. The audience applauded, but Maya was already thinking about her next project, a national initiative to identify and develop hidden expertise in service workers, administrative staff, and other employees whose qualifications might not match their current positions. The program, tentatively called Hidden Talent, Visible Impact, would be launched in partnership with the Department of Labor and major corporations committed to recognizing human potential in all its forms.
15 years later, Maya's autobiography, The Coffee Cup Lawyer: How Hidden Expertise Can Transform Organizations, had spent 18 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. But the book signing at Georgetown Law School felt more like a homecoming than a publicity event. The same auditorium where she had attended constitutional law lectures was now filled with current students, faculty members, and practicing attorneys who wanted to understand how one person's courage to speak up had transformed an industry. The most important lesson I learned, Maya told the audience during the Q&A session, is that expertise has value regardless of the context where it's discovered. But expertise without courage is just unused potential. The real transformation happens when people decide to step forward and use their knowledge to solve problems that matter. A third-year law student raised her hand. Miss Chen, your story is inspiring, but it's also somewhat unique. Most service workers don't have law degrees. How do we apply your model to identify and develop expertise in more typical situations? Maya smiled, recognizing the intelligent skepticism that law school was designed to cultivate. You're absolutely right that my specific situation was unusual, but every workplace contains hidden expertise, people with relevant experience, specialized knowledge, or problem-solving abilities that aren't reflected in their job descriptions. The key is creating systems that recognize and develop that expertise, rather than ignoring it because it doesn't fit traditional categories. The Hidden Talent Initiative had grown into a national movement, with over 500 companies implementing programs to identify and develop underutilized expertise in their workforces. The results had exceeded all expectations: increased innovation, improved employee satisfaction, reduced turnover, and measurable improvements in organizational performance.
The economic impact has been significant, Maya continued, citing statistics that demonstrated the program's effectiveness. But the human impact has been more important. We've helped over 50,000 people transition from jobs that underutilize their abilities to positions that match their capabilities. Some were immigrants with professional credentials that weren't recognized in the United States. Others were career changers who possessed relevant skills but lacked traditional qualifications. Many were simply people who had never been given the opportunity to demonstrate their full potential. After the event, Maya walked across the law school campus, remembering the young woman who had studied in these libraries, dreaming of using legal expertise to make the world more just. That woman could never have imagined the path that would lead from serving coffee to transforming corporate culture. But she had possessed the same fundamental belief that Maya still carried, that knowledge should serve justice regardless of the circumstances where it's discovered. The story that had begun with a handwritten note tucked under a coffee cup had become a movement that changed how organizations think about talent, expertise, and human potential. But Maya knew that the real legacy wasn't the awards, the book sales, or the policy changes. The real legacy was in the thousands of people who had found the courage to step forward and share their hidden expertise, transforming not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. As she walked through the campus gates towards her car, Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer Park, now a partner in the Meridian Institute and one of the country's leading experts on employment law innovation. Just received word that our Hidden Talent program is being implemented by the European Union as a model for workforce development. Thought you should know that your coffee cup note is still creating ripple effects around the world. Maya smiled, thinking about the invisible people in every workplace who possessed expertise that could solve problems, improve processes, and transform organizations, if only someone had the wisdom to listen and the courage to act on what they heard. The evening sun cast long shadows across the law school courtyard, and Maya realized that her story had come full circle. She had begun as a student seeking knowledge, became a lawyer serving justice, fell into invisibility serving coffee, and emerged as an advocate for recognizing human potential wherever it might be found. But the most important transformation had been internal, learning that professional worth wasn't determined by job titles or workplace hierarchies, but by the courage to use whatever expertise you possessed in service of something larger than yourself. 20 years later, the letter arrived on Meridian Industries' letterhead, but it was addressed to Maya at her home rather than at her office. The return address showed it came from the current CEO, a woman named Elena Rodriguez, who had been a junior analyst when Maya first implemented the compliance reforms.
Dear Ms. Chen, the letter began, I wanted you to know that yesterday we hired our newest legal counsel, a brilliant young man who has been working as a night janitor while studying for the bar exam. When he quietly pointed out a regulatory issue during a board meeting cleanup, I remembered your story. We didn't hesitate. His first day is Monday, and like you 20 years ago, he'll have the resources and respect his expertise deserves. The culture you created continues to transform lives. Thank you for teaching us that genius wears many uniforms, and courage is what makes it visible. Maya smiled, folding the letter carefully. Some stories never really end. They just inspire new beginnings. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.